there, everyone. Welcome to my channel, The Reconverted Catholic. I'm CV, a Catholic apologist, evangelist, and lifelong theology student. Well, it's time for a new series on this channel. Maybe I should call it a new old series. The videos in the series actually come from archive discussions I've had within the past year with Gary Michuta, the host of the podcast Hands-On Apologetics, featured on Virgin Most Powerful Radio on rumble.com. Gary is an apologist and author, and one of my favorite apologists out there, and there are many wonderful Catholic apologists. So Gary's among some of my favorites. Particularly, has a great way of taking complex information and making it, being able to put it into clear words and make it friendly for everyday people to understand. So, although the name of his show is called Hands-On Apologetics, it's really for all Catholic Christians. And Christians who also want to learn about our Catholic faith, but I'd say primarily for Catholic Christians to learn how to discuss our faith, defend it, and find the most plain English ways, clearest ways to defend our faith, and without having to be, again, a theologian or an apologist or for example, maybe someone speaking at a more scholarly level or having a more scholarly conversation. So this video, the first video, I'll be featuring, it's a dialogue Gary and I had about Gnosticism and its relationship to New Age ideas, so modern New Age ideas. Now, I have a video on my channel similar in how Gnosticism relates to modern New Age ideas and how we're having a lot of the same conversations as Catholic Christians. We're having a lot of the same conversations, about the New Age movement as early Catholic Christians said about Gnosticism, and a lot of that revolving around, my truth versus your truth type of debates. In this video, and also for the subsequent videos, so I'll be sharing the audio, the version of the podcast. I do have links to the videos, so I'll have that in the description section. But the audio, so for this video, I'll just have the audio embedded and with the Reconverted Catholic logo. But I highly encourage checking out the video version if you like as well, or if you're just, out and about and have your earbuds, on at the gym or work or somewhere and can listen to the audio version, that's great too. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into this first video. I welcome feedback, as always, comments, questions. Also, feel free to email me at trcatholic@gmail.com. Again, it's here at catholic@gmail.com. Let's jump into this first video, and also just another quick note for the subsequent videos. I do a quick intro, just set up into the video, but in this first introductory video, to give you just more of an overview of this series and my awesome talks with Gary Michuta. So hope you enjoy these talks as well. And again, feel free to leave your feedback and reach out to me. Thanks.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Michuta. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, Hands-On Apologetics. And we're going to talk about ancient heresies, modern heresies, and their deleterious effects on Christianity with our good friend Chris Vitelli. As you know, Chris was a Catholic who became Protestant, eventually became an atheist for 10 years through the influence of the new atheism. Eventually he made his way back home, and now he is an intellectual force out there in social media and dealing with issues like atheism, Gnosticism, and the spiritual but not religious crowd. You should check out his channel on YouTube. It's called The Reconverted Catholic. And Chris Vitelli, welcome back to Hands-On Apologetics.
Hey, Gary. Good to see you. I was just thinking here, this is, I think, third time's the charm, kind of situation. Last two times we met, had some technical issues, and we got right in.
Yeah, you're
This
right.
time just fine, so this is good.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, you're absolutely right. No technical problems at all. Although, in the segment right before now, I guess I unleashed a huge controversial issue.
Oh yeah.
In regards to the Three Stooges.
Oh.
And I mentioned Shemp being kind of like the fourth stooge, but Shemp actually was one of the original three. So, so this is going to be a very controversial episode. So, anyway, so how have you been, my friend?
Yeah, doing really well here. I appreciate you having me on here again. All is good. Just powering away with work and school and trying to finish up this, theology graduate degree here this year. So
excellent.
So,
yeah. Wow.
Going well.
Busy.
Yeah.
busy. So, So, Gnosticism, New Age. People might be surprised they think that there's any connection between the two, but actually, there's a lot of connections between the ancient heresy of Gnosticism and New Age movement.
Exactly. Yeah, I call the some of the early what we now call heresies, kind of more schismatic type movements, especially in the second century AD. I call them like early examples of the war on truth. More in the spiritual sense then, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it has some parallels to today. So I thought I'd start with first, excuse me, a little bit about that, and then maybe some history of Gnosticism for maybe some of the folks who aren't aware of some of that history, and other movements related to Gnosticism around the second century, and again, how they tie into some of the thoughts we hear among spiritual, not religious movements today. A lot of the same kind of language and sometimes even thought process, right, with that. So,
right. Awesome.
So if that sounds good. Okay, great. I've been thinking a lot about this over some time, and even after having studied these second century heresies, just because there have been, for those who are aware with church history, there have been no shortage of fires between the Catholic Church and other movements, either identifying as a Catholic Church or trying to and kind of cutting their own path, or other movements sort of separating from to make their own identity, and then clashing with the church. And so there's no shortage of movements like this throughout history. And it says a lot, I'll say, too, about the church and how the church is handled through, you think, centuries, right, of changes and, governmental powers, temporal powers, throughout, for example, Europe and the Mediterranean. I mean, if you think a mix of like massive cultural changes, wars, plague, famine, disease, challenges with, within the church, and then, with other movements or splinter type movements and so forth. And so I always think, wow, and 2,000 years later, here we are still standing, and sometimes it can be so sort of overwhelming and, mind numbing to think how far we've come, as a church and how we've evolved. But going back now to how I kind of came about this, started thinking about this is, as I was studying Gnosticism and also Marcionism and some other, again, heresies around that period of time, I thought, wow, some of these are very similar to some of the arguments I hear from then are sort of either similar today, or even versions of Jesus, how to understand Jesus, are sort of similar today too. And that is in kind of separating him from his sort of divinity, and kind of making it more of just a sort of, he's a philosophical kind of figure, or still keeping him as sort of a divine figure, but still more sort of philosophically related, that it's not tied to maybe necessarily one kind of understanding of truth or of faith, what that means, like what our core Christian theology means, what the gospel means, right? The charisma of our Christian faith. That some groups basically took some of that and just kind of splintered off and created their own movement from it. And there was a kind of a running theme here of, hey, I have a claim to the truth now, and so listen to me. Now, I think this is a problem throughout, of course it is, through human history. I think it's one of the consequences of our sort of wounded nature of how we wrestle with truth, and even if it's just staring at us in the face, or we've come to reason an understanding of something, between right and wrong, or truth, or a message that is intact, and then sometimes we want to pull it apart. And I'm trying not to get too abstract here, but point being that it's just been a fundamental issue among humans of like who's right and who's wrong, okay, at a very basic level, right? So to give a little kind of history of the Gnostics, right, and what really struck out to me about this particular group. First, they were one of a few different heretical type movements. Again, as we know them now as heretical type movements, then those movements thought they had the truth. They thought they were actually pioneering something that people should follow, right? Mm-hmm. But something common to all of them is that they were all very rooted in Greek philosophy. And with the Hellenistic influence at that time, of course, Greek being a common, or like you could say de facto kind of common language, right, between different cultures, philosophy having a big influence on these various cultures around throughout the Mediterranean. So different thoughts, kind of movements, thought movements sprung up out of philosophy. Now that could be a whole show in itself, right, conversation in itself. Right. But how it relates to Gnosticism and some of these other movements is they drew on some of these philosophies in addition to their understanding of these were Christians, okay? So they grew out of the first century Christians movements, okay, and churches that were then springing up throughout that region and in Rome and Antioch and, Asia Minor, what's now known as Turkey, Jerusalem, etc., okay? And so they were all part of this sort of greater movement. But then through leaders who started to kind of break away from what we understood and what we still understand as the traditional gospel, started kind of looking at Hellenistic philosophy, okay, really, Greek philosophy, really trying to understand that and then merge it or marry it with, Christian belief. So one of the leaders, his name was Valentinus, and then there was another person, Basilides, of a sort of separate movement. But Valentinus, Basilides, and Marcion, these are all figures around that time who all started sort of, again, branching away from what was the Catholic Church, what was growing as a Catholic Church, and even identified as the Catholic Church in the 2nd century. Like now we see in writings, like actually in church documents, right, referring to the church as such. So these, for example, these individuals, these, you could say, thought movement leaders, started really challenging what was the understanding of the message, our core theology, our understanding of it, and started from there, like coming up with kind of more, you could say, more sort of philosophical rooted kind of ideas, but then also mixing them with again, what we understand as our Christian core teaching. So, for example, with the Gnostics, okay, their belief, they grew out of an idea that, and a Gnostic, of course, meaning coming from gnosis or knowledge, right? Their whole movement was rooted in thinking that, okay, we have some special knowledge about Christ that the apostles, it was first delivered to the apostles, okay? And then they, okay, were privy, this particular group, to information that Jesus shared with the apostles, okay, but not with all the disciples, but with, select fewer apostles. And then they had this special knowledge, okay, in understanding Christ and his nature and purpose and so forth, that took a more sort of, it took more like intellectual depth, deep diving, really to understand that. So this group claimed to have that kind of knowledge. So it's sort of kind of already sort of an entitled way of approaching this, like, hey, we've got the truth now, right? Although they're not unique to it. So from there, then they actually, this movement started growing in popularity because of it, because it had this attractiveness, it had this mystery to it, like, oh wow, these people know something about Jesus that maybe nobody else knows, so let's listen. So it started gaining some traction. But then, as the movement was growing, its view on Jesus was much different. It started becoming much, much more radically different from, just the Catholic Church at that time. One being that, for example, like they didn't see that Jesus was incarnate, like came down, like as fully God, or fully God and fully man, and how we understand it, but more that a spirit. It was sort of like a bait and switch routine that Jesus occupied a body that had a spirit in it already, and basically he kicked out the spirit and said, "Okay, I'm taking over," and then fulfilled his mission. So. Right there off the bat, that's obviously a kind of vast departure of how other Christians understood Jesus at that time, or even other sort of philosophical related approaches to understanding Jesus. And then also how the Gnostics and the other heretical movements at the time, this is something that really stuck out to me, and you see this in the world today, a question that was resolved actually almost 2,000 years ago, but you still see like the God of the Old Testament being different from the God of the New Testament, that there's this, good God, bad God, right? That the Old Testament God was, okay, it must have had to have been somebody completely different, because it just doesn't square up with the New Testament God. So this thinking actually really like perpetuated quite a bit in the 2nd century, this idea, and among 3 different movements. You could say mostly in Marcionism, it was pretty heavy, but the Gnostics also understood as well. In fact, they had a different story of creation, variation on it, where there was a sort of, there was a bad God, okay? There's a good God and a bad God. There's a bad God, and there is a mother figure, not to be confused with Blessed Mother Mary, but somebody who actually was instrumental in the bad God creating a fallen world, and for which we would have to be saved from that. So I'll actually pause there because I see we're coming up on a break.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Chris Vitelli of the Reconverted Catholic channel on YouTube, talking about New Age and Gnosticism especially. The Gnostics, import philosophy, kind of turn Christianity into a philosophy with some really different radical ideas about Jesus. You were just starting to get into this idea of the good creation, bad creation, I guess duality that you often find within Gnosticism.
Right. So if I were to go to say, like, call the tenets of Gnosticism, what their belief looked like at the end of the day was, one, again, that you had Jesus who had visited a bodily dwelling, basically, okay, kicked out one spirit, took over, carried out his kind of mission. 2, that's 1. 2, they believed that what they understood traced back to the apostles. Because again, as I mentioned in the earlier segment, they thought they had information given directly to the apostles that, the rest of the world basically wasn't privy to it. So there was, so they had that. Then they had actually released a document called the Second Treatise of the Great Seth. And in that document, it goes into, again, more about their beliefs and how they understand Christ, and this again, this kind of deeper search for knowledge and deeper meaning about Christ that maybe other Christians they're not aware of this. And even claiming that Jesus wrote this particular work too. So, and then also around the same time, and from the Gnostic movement and surrounding movements, heresies, several gospels sprung up, in addition to the 4 gospels that we know that we have in the canonized, scripture, and also epistles. So suddenly there were all these claims like, and these movements were drawing from these other works, or Gnostics or other movements, or what they were at least aware of them, and where were these other documents, their place, and in understanding again the gospel, what was the true gospel. So yeah, and then finally their view, and also other heretical movements around that time, all drawing on this idea that there was a bad God, and he created purposely a fallen world, okay, and did it actually tricked you could say a mother goddess figure, Sophia, tricked her sort of unwittingly into kind of helping make this happen for creation to fall, and then Jesus would come later at some point, right, and save. So under a good God, and save creation. And they use their own sort of like, their take on philosophy and sort of on scripture, loosely on scripture and some on philosophy, of tying this together, how they could, show that their beliefs trace back more to the apostles. But a lot of it was just sort of, again, what they developed on, listening to leaders who were well educated. These things, the leaders of these movements, it's not just that they were sort of crazy or they just wanted to be on the fringe. These folks had actually spent a lot of time studying what, philosophy, and then of course their own Christian faith, and again trying to marry the two. Again, it was almost like just one giant thought experiment. But it also shows that these movements thought that they had, claims to truth. They said, okay, I call it again, like a my truth versus, your truth, something we see in society right now. Now that's gone to a whole extreme about like even physical reality of what's true and not true.
Yeah.
But when you have, spiritual reality, you could see that they come from kind of the same sort of problem or place, right? And that's thinking that, okay, I have some information that other people do not. And so you better follow me, if you want the correct information or the truth. Mm-hmm. And also just the idea of taking something that was, a fundamental understanding of something, and then possibly changing it to like how you want to believe it. Okay, which you gather from these movements that it was attractive to their followers, to believe this, and it felt like they were part of something big, kind of special, of a greater good. But they were clearly had gone way off the rails, and it took, later in the second century, one of the church fathers, Irenaeus, wrote this amazing work against heresies, and went after, refuted all the major heresies at the time, including Gnosticism. Does a great job, really, of I've kind of thought like, if Irenaeus was living, say, in the modern day and made a YouTube video, it would really be like Irenaeus destroys, something like
Yeah,
that.
Right.
Yeah.
He really does.
Yeah, because he really does. He pretty much levels all the heresies. And, a big part of how he does that is he traces back the gospel message, okay? Like, see how this original gospel message actually hasn't changed. So he shows that, the thread, the continuity with it. He shows a thread in apostolic succession, okay, and how we've preserved these teachings over time, okay, and how there's a more direct link. And even some, big problem out of the gate is, I also call this like early examples of cherry picking of scripture. On the Marcion heresy, for example, Marcion, stuck mostly with Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and some of Paul's writings. That was like his, like, okay, this is how I'm going to form most of my belief or my understanding. Okay. The Gnostics, they were kind of a bit more even sort of just liberal in how they were kind of choosing texts and philosophies and stuff like that. But just altogether, I have this understanding of certain passage in scripture or what interpretation, right? And then run with it into a completely different possible belief system or what. So Irenaeus showed how, like, for example, like the idea of a good, a bad God in the Old Testament versus good God, right? Pointing out how these groups were following, actually, like, for example, like Gnosticism was this mix of Jewish influenced ideas, okay, and even philosophies mixed with Hellenistic philosophy, mixed with, what we understood as like the gospel, okay, and they were fine with like taking what worked for them or, for their movements or belief, and then sort of tossing out the rest. And that's, part of what Irenaeus pointed out in his refuting these heresies is like, okay, if you're gonna, in so many words, right, I'm paraphrasing, if you're really gonna, pick and choose and cherry pick here, well then, again, context, right, which we even hear today in interpreting scripture, got to get context. I have to read, I have to understand what, and even our history, context of our history and its continuity. So, all that said, and for anybody who hasn't read Against Heresies, if you get that, I highly encourage it, because it's again, it's an incredible work, and it goes, again, it speaks to a problem of cherry picking and my truth versus your truth, and then also taking sort of philosophical type ideas about Jesus, and then if you fast forward to today, more modern day, I had said when I first started studying Gnosticism and related movements, I thought, wow, it's like as if they took say like a Deepak Chopra, okay, from today, and maybe a new atheist, and took him and put him in a time machine and sent him back right to that time, and then back, and then took these ideas to create like spiritual but not religious type ideas. Like one is a big one right now is Christ consciousness, right? So it's okay, Jesus, the essence of, or Jesus's message. That's, it's something that is sort of built into our consciousness, that we have this Christ-like moral guide, right? And Christ was an example, an epitome of that example of, how we're supposed to live our life, but more again, in a just purely metaphysical, or just more like, again, dealing with ideas about energy and consciousness and so forth and what they mean. And some of these ideas are kind of fuzzy, right? Because when you try to pin them down, they don't necessarily mean, they don't have the literal meaning, and it gets kind of confusing, like even the word energy. But now you see in today's age a similar problem. And this is growing, this starts going back centuries, right? We can't just pin it on the Protestant Reformation, or like even the Enlightenment era, or, dawn of modern science. I mean, there's so much that's developed in the last several hundred years that's affected our, Western thought. But a lot of spiritual but not religious ideas try to take like progressive ideas within the last, and growing out of like Enlightenment, say post-modernism, post-modernist type ideas, mixed with Eastern kind of, or not Eastern, I'm sorry, ancient history, or sort of ancient beliefs, and trying to marry the two, and then come up with this sort of more abstract, even the way I'm explaining it, does it even make sense, right? It's like, it's just kind of like picking and choosing a belief, and it's sounding outwardly very intelligent, but actually kind of falling on its face when you really pick it apart.
Yeah. It's a very American kind of thing. First, it's a do-it-yourself adventure where you build your own spirituality, and you kind of pick and choose the stuff that you like, and just you forget the other stuff. So you like the idea of reincarnation, but you don't like the idea of reincarnating downward, like it's believed in the East. So it's only upward, and that's our belief, So it's like they pick and choose beliefs to fit them together in this larger do-it-yourself adventure of enlightenment.
Right, and then making claims of, that they now have, like some spiritual but not religious folks or type movements, they're making their own truth claims. So they're saying, see, I now have the deeper knowledge, and this is one of the problems with and spiritual but not religious covers so many different types of thoughts about spirituality, right? It's such a big, broad, topic, but it's all based first on this idea of like, you can divorce spirituality from religion, which is a whole other, again, topic in itself, because you really can't, okay, and then, but once you've done that, making a claim that, hey, similar again to the Gnostics, we've been enlightened. We have this now new knowledge, okay? And if you come to our side, you're going to get the full story.
Yeah, very good. We're chatting with Chris Vitelli of the Reconverted Catholic channel on YouTube, talking about Gnosticism, New Age, and their effects on Christianity. More to come right after this.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Michuta. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Chris Vitelli, talking about Gnosticism, New Age, and their deleterious effects on Christianity. And, very important point you made there, Chris, right at the end of the last segment about the seductiveness of Gnostic thought, that you're in the know, you're somehow above people since you have this special access to knowledge. And I also appreciate that you also tied in the new atheist with that, because there is that kind of mentality, right? I mean, wasn't it Dawkins who said that they should be called the Brights, which I just thought was kind of like a modern version of Gnostics.
Yeah, right. Right. He even helped spawn. I think it was an institute for. I don't want to. It's something like about sort of progressive thought, right? That he. For Foundation for Faith and Science and Reason, not Faith and Reason. Imagine if he had a foundation like that. No, it's for Science and Reason. Yeah, that was it. So, right. And then we also have the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Sure.
Yeah. They're semi sort of kind of significant movement here in the U.S. So New Atheists, it's funny because I remember when I first started studying Marcion heresy, I thought, wow, here's something that, and Marcion was all about, okay, good God versus bad God, and bad God Yahweh, okay, and then okay, Christians, how are you going to square that one, right? And funny that and I refer to Irenaeus's work, right, of again just leveling that argument, fully refuting it 2,000 years ago, and it made me think, wow, here we are 2,000 years later and still addressing a lot of the same arguments. But I think sometimes just in general. When we're defending our Catholic faith, right? In apologetics, how many times do we answer a lot of the same questions that could be from, atheists, spiritual, not religious, other Christian denominations or what? And we have books about it, right? We even have a little handy guide of, arguments against the Catholic Christian faith kind of thing, right? And you think that many of these were also solved like centuries ago. But here we are still in modern day, having to refute the same challenges, the same problems, the same even approach, which is something really golden about, how Irenaeus refuted these heresies at the time. He was talking a lot about their approach to understanding, right, the gospel and scripture, and how to follow the whole, okay, if you're going to make a claim, you need to be able to support the claim and show, right, not the evidence and the continuity in that. And that was that was really a driver behind his work, is the how, not just the what and the why, how you're going about doing this. And it's a problem today that we struggle with. It's really the first few, I think there was an article about this recently, something about, and I may have mentioned it then the first time I appeared on your show here, Gary, about the first few hundred years of Christianity, we're sort of like a mirror of the first couple hundred years right now in modern day. Okay. Mm-hmm. One, and how Christians are kind of now very counterculture in Western society, or it's become, some of that. Okay. And then other movements springing around that draw on Christian ideas, but then redress them into other beliefs, right? Like Christ consciousness. You can just take and think that this is not even, if you just go back a few hundred years to, our forefathers, for example, here in the U.S., Thomas Jefferson, right? That he wrote the book, The Faith and Moral Teachings of Belief of Jesus, right? So he took out everything about Jesus being divine and miracles and so forth, and just boiled it down to Jesus was a wise, teacher. And you have spiritual but not religious movements now, and because they've been exposed to other belief systems, and if they've followed, say, a Deepak Chopra, or if they're familiar with the late Joseph Campbell, if they've studied some psychology like Carl Jung, and they start going into religious phenomenology, people who go they do their research, they don't just want to have some spiritual belief, but they really want to understand their belief. And in one hand, you think, okay, great, they're seekers and they want to, get the knowledge. But then on the other hand, are they getting, the correct information, and are they using the right methodology? right, to reach that conclusion. And it has to start with, though, being fair to the premise of the story, like the gospel, right? Like, what was the original gospel? And then you either, if it's true or not true, well, then you start with that as a base, rather than creating a completely different, okay, idea, and then saying, and you can make a claim, sure, that it's true, but then you have to be able to support it. And so what ends up happening, and you see this again now in modern day, is any spiritual related movement that then brings in Jesus to it, or somehow, Jesus was just basically, again, just a wise teacher, right? Or he's part of some cosmic maybe understanding of, of spirituality. But that this goes into another kind of topic for another time too, about, all religions claiming to be equally valid, right? Or some people say that all religions are equally valid, or all paths, lead to the same God. So that, not to go so far down, that rabbit hole kind of thing. But point being that there's today, and now that this war on truth and reality, point being is that it is a spiritual and a sort of physical reality battle about that, and a spiritual battle, and like a sort of resurrected battle from now 2,000 years ago, right? Of trying to take ideas from Christianity and, again, reform them into other beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's amazing to me that it survives, under different guises. But the only way it survives is by, like you said, kind of de-investing the incarnation from Jesus and just merely make him one of many sages, right? Because once you start taking into account that he's a real historic person, what he did and what he claimed, then you have no choice but to become Christian in some historical sense, right? Yeah, he's no longer in the safe zone where you can make him out to be however you want him to be.
Exactly, because otherwise you're doing a disservice, right, to the fundamental gospel. If you're then perverting it in some way, all right, then you have to ask yourself, is it because that's what you want to believe? Okay. And the same could be said about Christians, though, right, too. Like in my atheist years, well, like, that's what you get an argument of, like, you want to believe. But to your point, what you just said is, you look at, okay, all the information in front of you. Okay, you see what is the base message there. Okay, what is being taught, right? And then if you don't agree with it, okay, you can have that conversation and work through it. People, they'll do what they're doing. They think, okay, well, I'll just create some other kind of belief from it. I'll create my own truth, or whatever works for me. And it's why I call, like, spiritual but not religious. It's I call it what's in it for me spirituality, right? Mm-hmm. It is, and that's what I gathered from even these early heretical movements, even if they weren't maybe saying that out loud or thinking that per se. There were elements of it, of this entitlement of, I've got a truth now, and I'm in this special place. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's attractive, it's appealing. I think we just do. We're attracted to mystery, for a variety of reasons, or something, somebody who seems to be really intelligent or have special knowledge, or just a really charismatic speaker, right? Why we've had problems with these extreme, like, cults, beliefs, and then many. In fact, my fiance and I just recently watched a documentary about a fundamentalist type, cult, and just what all that looked like. And there again, there was a claim of, like, okay, this is how we understand truth, and then can you see any of the perversions in it? And that's even a more extreme example, but just in sort of. Just everyday people seeking out some belief or trying to understand what spirituality means. You want to start with doing the belief justice. Okay, this is the core Christian gospel. Okay, mm-hmm. If you don't agree with it, you simply don't agree with it. But some things are a binary decision. It's either this or gospel. Yeah. Right? That we all Christians, essentially, like, this is, this is the kerygma, right? And outside of that, if you just don't accept it, then ask yourself, again, what are you seeking? Are you wanting to, is it that you're just trying to find something to believe that makes you comfortable, like that makes you happy, or are you trying to find the truth? And that's what almost makes it sort of ironic, because you can have like spiritual but not religious or minded folks who think that they have the truth, right? But really, it's more about, when you strip it down, it's really more about just being right, or feeling right, or feeling like, yeah, I finally found the thing that I think is going to work best for me.
Right. Yeah. And that's, I think, what makes evangelism so difficult. Is because it's for New Agers especially, it's kind of a fantasy-based worldview, and it's difficult to get them to see right and wrong. To see nature and reality as it is, right? Because it's more like the things that they want to be true. That's what's true. It's not necessarily what is true.
Yeah, which then leads into various forms of relativism.
Yeah.
Then when you have various forms of relativism, it's going to affect morals and values, and then morals and values become more relative, and then then the domino effect, right, of some of what we see right now, and so
yeah, absolutely. Well, we're coming to the end of the program. Yeah. We have about 30 seconds or so. Tell us a little bit about the Reconverted Catholic channel.
Yeah, so it's this channel. It's basically a resource for fellow Catholic Christians to either deepen in our faith, and that's either through recommended reading. I have videos about exploring faith formation related videos. I've had other apologists on the channel to discuss topics. I've tried to hit on key topics related today, like dialoguing with spiritual but not religious, how to, dialogue with spiritual not religious atheists, agnostics, so forth, how to deal with sort of Catholic response to modern social topics. And now I have a series now similar to the Journey Home on EWTN, but I'm doing this more at a local level with different parishes. I have a show called The Return where I feature reversion and conversion stories. And actually, as a quick sidebar, that's also what prompted me to get more interest, in studying like New Age, or the differences between, like Gnosticism and New Age, or similarities, because of people's reversion stories and from coming from those backgrounds.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you again, Gary.
All right, Chris Vitelli, check it out, the Reconverted Catholic channel on YouTube. And, wow, time's flowing. Coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you. Terry and Justin Show. Thank you so much for listening. God willing, we'll be back again tomorrow. Do this thing we call Hands on Apologetics. Bye-bye.